A twin trick. Donald and Douglas, the two Scottish tender engines, have lived on the island of Sodor for many years. They are both practical, peppery, and very proud. The two Scottish engines were delivering some passengers to Harwich Station. They didn't want to be late. One night, after a long and hard day's work on the Little Western, Donald and Douglas both came into their sheds. Douglas was feeling rather cross. "Aye, Dougie, what's the matter?" Donald asked his twin, Douglas. "Aye, Donald, those trucks were causing a great deal of trouble for me earlier today." Douglas sighed. But then an idea flew into Douglas's funnel. "Aye, Dunny, I have an idea for what we should do tomorrow," Douglas said to Donald. "Aye, Dougie, and what would that be?" Donald asked to Douglas. "Aye, Donald, we should play a trick on the other engines," Douglas said to Donald, as Douglas told Donald his plan. Donald really liked the idea. "Aye, that's a marvelous idea, Dougie. We'll swap our tenders and act very suspicious. Plus, we'll see how far our trick can go," Donald said to Douglas. Douglas smiled as the two twins fell happily to sleep. Early the next morning, in the cold light of dawn, Donald and Douglas were getting ready to do their trick on some of the other engines. Donald had Douglas's tender, and Douglas had Donald's tender. Both twins were snickering in delight. Donald especially snickered eagerly. "Aye, Dougie, this is going to be a very exciting plan. I can't wait to pull a trick on Oliver," Donald said to Douglas. "Aye, me too. I wonder which engines I'm going to see at Knapford," Douglas said to his twin Donald. Just then, Donald and Douglas's drivers came to see them. They were very surprised at the fact that the two engines had their tenders swapped. "Oh my, you two," said Douglas's driver. "What is going on here?" He said. "Aye, driver, we're going to pull a little prank on some of the other engines," Douglas said excitedly to his driver. "Well," he said, "that's not too surprising. Anyways, I have important news for you two. Sir Topham Hatt told me to tell you two that you are going to be extra busy today. Donald, you have to take some trucks over to Oliver at another station on the Little Western. And Douglas, you're going to be helping out with passengers today at Knapford Station," said Donald and Douglas's driver to the two twins. Donald was very excited as he snickered quietly. "Aye, driver, we've got this," said Donald to his driver. His driver chuckled. "Ugh, that's what I like to hear, you two. Now come on, let's get to work," said their drivers. As Donald and Douglas chuffed on their way to get their jobs done, as both twins snickered quietly to each other about the rest of their plan. That's when, later on that afternoon, Donald arrived to collect his trucks where Oliver was waiting. Oliver was very surprised seeing Donald with Douglas's tender, as was Toad. "Oh, good afternoon, Donald," Oliver said in a confused voice. Why do you have Douglas's tender?" Oliver said to Donald. Toad agreed. "Yeah, quite so, Mr. Oliver. It's really strange seeing Donald with Douglas's tender, Mr. Oliver," said Toad to Oliver. Donald was a little nervous. He didn't want to ruin their little trick in front of Oliver. Then, Another idea flew into his funnel. Aye, Oliver, me and Dougie decided to swap our tenders. Mainly because we wanted to try something different for today, Donald said to Oliver. Oliver was still confused. Why did you guys want to swap tenders for the day? I find that very strange. Very strange indeed, Oliver said to Donald. Aye, Oliver, it's just for today. We'll be having our tenders back together in no time, said Donald. That's when Donald was coupled up to the trucks as he puffed on his way. That's when, later on that late afternoon, Douglas arrived at Knapford Station to collect his train. Thomas and Henry were also there. Thomas had to collect some passengers to take to Farquhar Station on his branch line, as Henry was waiting for his next passenger train. Thomas was very surprised to see Douglas with Donald's tender, as was Annie and Clarabelle and Henry. Good afternoon, Douglas. Why do you have Donald's tender? Thomas said curiously to Donald. Annie and Clarabelle were also confused. Oh, dearie me, Douglas, why do you have Donald's tender? Said Annie. Indeed, Annie, said Clarabelle to Annie. Henry also agreed. Yeah, Douglas, why do you have Donald's tender? Something's a little suspicious, Henry said to Douglas. Douglas snickered, only a little bit. Aye, Thomas and Henry, plus Annie and Clarabelle. Me and Donald decided to swap our tenders for today, Douglas said to Thomas, Annie, Clarabelle, and Henry. Even Thomas was a little suspicious. Something is a little fishy here, Thomas said. Are you sure Donald agreed to swap tenders? Thomas said to Douglas. Aye, yes, Thomas, Annie, Clarabelle, and Henry. We both agreed, said Douglas to Thomas, Annie, Clarabelle, and Henry. That's when the guard blew his whistle and it was time for Douglas to leave. Well, Thomas, Annie, Clarabelle, and Henry, I've got to go. I got to deliver these passengers. See you later, said Douglas to Thomas, Annie, Clarabelle, and Henry, as Douglas set off. Annie could have felt a little bit more stranger that the two twins had swapped their tenders. Oh, dearie me, Thomas. I'm a little worried about Donald and Douglas. I've never seen them swap their tenders like this before, said Annie to Thomas. Thomas looked at Annie, and he completely agreed. Yeah, Annie, I've never seen Donald and Douglas swap their tenders like this before. Something's really fishy here, Thomas said to Annie. While Douglas was delivering passengers to different parts of the island, Donald was making good time with his goods train to the shunting yard. He was snickered quietly as their plan was beginning to work. Donald snickered in delight. Aye, it feels so good to do a trick like this. I'm sure Dougie is doing quite well with his part of the trick. Hee hee, Donald said, as Donald made his way to the shunting yard to drop off his trucks. After Donald had dropped off his trucks at the shunting yard to help out Oliver, there was trouble. On Donald's line, the points weren't switched properly. Donald didn't know this. Then there was even more trouble. Douglas, who was finishing up dropping off passengers, he was coming on the same line as his twin Donald. Aye, Donald, watch out, Douglas said. But then it was too late, as the two twins crashed into each other. Luckily, no one had been hurt. Donald and Douglas's drivers and firemen had both jumped clear, but the two engines were in a wreck. Oh, that hurt. Are you alright there, Donald? Douglas said to Donald. I'm alright, Dougie, Donald said to his twin Douglas. As Donald and Douglas waited for help to arrive, Bulgy was making his way to Knapford Station to drop off some passengers. This made him very cross. Ugh, what is it with these engines causing accidents on the main line for us vehicles? Ugh, Bulgy groaned. Douglas spoke to Bulgy. We're sorry, Bulgy. We just wanted to do a small trick, that's all. Ugh, not for me, because I want there to be more roads than rails. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'll be on my way, Bulgy said, as he drove off. Then, that's when Thomas arrived with Sir Topham Hatt. Sir Topham Hatt was very cross. Donald and Douglas, what is the meaning of this? Why have you both derailed like this on the main line? Sir Topham Hatt scolded severely to Donald and Douglas. The two twins stared at their buffers as they both began to laugh a little. Sir, we just wanted to do a small trick, said Douglas to Sir Topham Hatt. A trick? Said Sir Topham Hatt to Donald and Douglas. What kind of trick were you two planning? Sir Topham Hatt said to Donald and Douglas. As both twins spoke. So yesterday, I didn't like how rude the trucks were being to me, so I decided today, me and Donald would swap our tenders and act a little suspicious towards you and some of the other engines. So that's why we decided to do this trick. We didn't know that it would lead to an accident, sir, said Donald and Douglas to Sir Topham Hatt. Sir Topham Hatt paused for a moment. Then he laughed, as did Thomas. Oh, Donald and Douglas, you two did a very decent trick, but next time, don't do it like that on the main line. You don't want to be like what happened to Oliver, Emily, and Percy, do you? Said Sir Topham Hatt. Thomas laughed. Well, Donald and Douglas, I gotta admit, you guys did a pretty funny trick, said Thomas to the two twins. Henry couldn't agree more. Ha! Donald and Douglas, your trick was pretty funny, but you need to be a little bit more careful next time. But you guys did a pretty decent trick regardless. Henry said to the two twins. At the end of the day, after Donald and Douglas were put back on the rails and their tenders were back to their respective engines, Douglas spoke first. Donald, even though our trick went a little bit too far, I'm glad that we did do a small trick today, said Douglas to Donald. Donald agreed with his twin Douglas. I couldn't agree more, Dougie, but we'll keep our tricks at the minimum next time. We don't want to get into an accident like that again. Just kind of like what happened with that spiteful brake van all those years ago, Donald said to Douglas. Douglas couldn't agree more with his twin Donald. And in the end, Douglas was glad that he and his twin Donald pulled a trick on some of the other engines. But next time they know not to make their trick be so over the top. Do you think Donald and Douglas will play another trick again? That's another story.